The summer of 1991 arrived in Millfield, Ohio with an unusual intensity. By mid-June, temperatures had already climbed into the high 80s, the kind of heat that made the horizon shimmer above the asphalt and turned car seats into branding irons. In this small town of just under 8,000 souls, nestled between rolling green hills and dense woodland, the Reynolds family had settled into their routine for the season. Thomas and Diana Reynolds had moved to Millfield 5 years earlier, with their twin daughters, Jessica and Emma. The appeal was obvious: affordable housing, good schools, and a sense of community that had long since vanished from the Cleveland suburb they'd left behind. Their single-story ranch home on Oak Ridge Drive sat at the edge of town, backing up to a stretch of woods that local children had turned into their playground for generations. At 6 years old, the Reynolds twins were identical in appearance, but divergent in spirit. Jessica was the leader, first to speak and first to act, with a fearlessness that both impressed and terrified her parents. Emma followed, quieter and more thoughtful, often pulling her sister back from the edge of trouble. Together they formed a unit so complete that neighbors sometimes spoke of them as a single entity, the Reynolds girls. Security camera footage from the Millfield Savings Bank, located 2 blocks from the Reynolds home, would later place the time at 7:52 a.m., when Diana's blue 1988 Ford Taurus pulled out of the driveway. From the bank's grainy footage, investigators could make out 3 figures in the car, Diana driving, and what appeared to be 2 small forms in the back seat. This would be the last confirmed sighting of Jessica and Emma Reynolds. By 3:30 p.m., Diana had completed her shift at the library. Her co-worker, Elaine Foster, would later recall that Diana seemed perfectly normal throughout the day, even mentioning plans to take the girls berry-picking that weekend. Diana drove to Little Explorers, the summer program housed in the basement of the Methodist Church, arriving at approximately According to the program director, Pamela Hughes, Diana entered the building alone, asked for her daughters, and was informed they had never been dropped off that morning. What followed was the beginning of a nightmare that would consume not just the Reynolds family but the entire town of Millfield for decades to come. "I know I dropped them off," Diana reportedly told Hughes, voice rising with each word. "I walked them to the door. I watched them go inside." Hughes's statement to police described Diana's rapid descent from confusion to panic, culminating in her running back to her car to check if, by some impossible circumstance, the girls had remained there all day. The car was empty. Diana's next call was to Thomas, then to the Millfield Police Department. Officer James Donahue was the first to respond. His initial report classified the situation as a miscommunication, noting that children often wandered between activities in small towns like Millfield. This assessment changed dramatically when he interviewed the staff at Little Explorers and confirmed that neither Jessica nor Emma had been seen that day. By 4:45 p.m., what began as a routine call had escalated into a missing persons case. The Reynolds home became the command center for the search. Thomas arrived from the hardware store, ashen-faced and disoriented. Neighbors gathered on the front lawn, organizing into search parties, while Diana sat at the kitchen table, repeating her account to increasingly skeptical detectives. "I drove them there," she insisted, her voice hoarse from crying. "I watched them walk through the front door." Jessica was wearing her purple shorts and white t-shirt with the rainbow. Emma had on her denim overalls and yellow shirt. They each had a lunchbox. Jessica's was Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Emma's had unicorns on it. The specificity of Diana's recollection would later be noted in Detective Michael Harmon's report as unusually detailed, though whether this detail suggested truthfulness or careful construction remained a point of contention among investigators. By nightfall, more than 200 volunteers were combing the woods behind the Reynolds home, the grounds of Little Explorers, and every street, yard, and vacant lot in between. The following morning, June 18th, the FBI arrived. Special Agent Victoria Winters took command of the investigation, expanding the search radius and implementing a tip line. Local news stations ran hourly updates, broadcasting the twins' school photos alongside a number to call with information. By noon, over 50 tips had come in, most amounting to nothing more than well-intentioned neighbors reporting normal activities from the previous day. One call, however, stood out. Marilyn Davidson, a retired schoolteacher who lived 3 houses down from the Reynolds, reported seeing a dark-colored van, maybe green or blue, parked across from the Reynolds home around 8:30 a.m. on the 7th. She couldn't recall the make or model but mentioned it had no windows on the sides and appeared somewhat dirty, like it had been driven on country roads. This report shifted the investigation's focus. If Diana had indeed dropped the girls off at Little Explorers, as she maintained, how had they ended up back at their home? And if they hadn't been dropped off, where had Diana gone during the hours she claimed to be at work? Library records confirmed Diana's presence from 9:15 a.m. until 3:15 p.m. Security footage from the Millfield Savings Bank showed her car leaving the Reynolds driveway at 7:52 a.m. But the next confirmed sighting was the library's sign-in sheet at 9:15 a.m. What happened during that 83-minute gap became the first major question of the investigation. On June 19th, 2 days after the disappearance, police executed a search warrant on the Reynolds home and vehicles. Luminol testing in Diana's Ford Taurus revealed no evidence of blood. Dog hairs were found on the back seat, but the Reynolds family owned a golden retriever named Cooper, making this unsurprising. The car's trunk contained library books, a bag of groceries purchased the previous weekend, and a spare tire. Nothing suggested foul play. The house itself yielded few clues. The twins' bedroom was exactly as one would expect twin beds, with matching pink comforters, a shelf lined with stuffed animals, and a small desk where they did art projects. Their pajamas were found folded on their respective beds, suggesting they had dressed for the day. Their toothbrushes were damp, indicating they had completed their morning routine. On the kitchen counter, investigators found 2 lunchboxes, one featuring Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, the other decorated with unicorns. Inside each was a sandwich, an apple, a small bag of potato chips, and a juice box. This discovery directly contradicted Diana's statement that the girls had taken their lunchboxes to Little Explorers. When confronted with this inconsistency, Diana became hysterical. "That's not possible," she kept saying, according to Detective Harmon's notes. "I made their lunches. I put them in their backpacks. They took them when we left." Thomas Reynolds stood by his wife, though witnesses described him as shell-shocked during this period. His alibi was solid. Multiple co-workers and customers confirmed his presence at the hardware store from 8 a.m. until he received Diana's call at approximately 4. The investigation expanded to include a thorough examination of both parents' backgrounds. Thomas and Diana had met at Ohio State University in 1982, married in 1984, and the twins were born in 19. Yet as days passed without a breakthrough, public sentiment began to shift. The case received national attention, featured on the evening news and in USA Today. The headline in the Millfield Gazette on June 23 read, "6 days gone. Where are the Reynolds twins?" Below it, a smaller headline asked the question that had begun to circulate through town. What happened during the missing hour? Diana's insistence that she had dropped the girls off at Little Explorers became increasingly problematic as no evidence emerged to support her claim. No staff member or child at the program remembered seeing the twins that day. No one witnessed them entering or leaving the building. Security cameras at the church were focused on the parking lot rather than the entrance, showing Diana's car arriving at 8:05 a.m. and departing at 8:12 a.m., but not capturing whether the girls entered the building. Those 7 minutes became the focus of intense scrutiny. If Diana was telling the truth, the twins had disappeared from inside a building where dozens of other children and several adults were present, without anyone noticing. If she was not telling the truth, those 7 minutes represented the last time Jessica and Emma Reynolds were known to be alive. On June 25th, a new witness came forward. Robert Jenkins, a mail carrier whose route included the area around Little Explorers, told investigators he had seen two young girls matching the twins' description, walking along Maple Street, approximately half a mile from the church, at around 8:30 a.m. on the 7th. He recalled noticing them because they were alone, unusual for children so young, but he hadn't thought to report it until seeing their photos on the news. This sighting, if accurate, suggested the girls had left Little Explorers shortly after being dropped off, or had never entered at all. It also placed them in the vicinity of Marilyn Davidson's reported van sighting, creating a potential scenario where the twins had either wandered off or been lured away. The investigation split into multiple threads. One team focused on canvassing the area around Maple Street, another on identifying the mysterious van, while a third continued to probe the Reynolds family themselves. Diane underwent a polygraph test on June. The results were inconclusive, a fact that investigators chose not to make public, but which leaked to the press nonetheless, fueling speculation. By the 1-month mark, the daily searches had dwindled to weekend volunteer efforts. The FBI maintained a presence, but scaled back their on-site personnel. The tips, which had flooded in at hundreds per day during the first week, slowed to a trickle. The Reynolds case was entering the phase that all too many missing persons cases reach the long, agonizing wait for a breakthrough that might never come. Throughout that summer, the Reynolds home remained a hub of activity. Diana and Thomas converted their dining room into what they called the finding room, walls covered with maps marked with search areas, bulletin boards pinned with potential sightings, and a large calendar tracking the days since the disappearance. Behind the scenes, the strain was taking its toll. Friends reported that Thomas had lost 20 pounds by August. Diana had been prescribed sedatives to help her sleep. The couple began attending therapy together, trying to navigate a grief that had no resolution. The investigation continued to pursue leads, but each seemed to evaporate upon closer examination. The dark van was never located. Robert Jenkins's sighting could not be corroborated by any other witness. A search of sex offender registries within a 100-mile radius yielded several persons of interest, all of whom were investigated and ultimately eliminated as suspects. As fall approached, the Reynolds case remained open, but increasingly inactive. The twins' empty bedroom became a shrine, untouched, except for Diana's daily visits to dust and straighten items that had not been moved since June. Cooper, the family's golden retriever, often slept at the foot of Emma's bed, waiting for a return that seemed less likely with each passing day. Then, on September 12, 1991, nearly 3 months after the disappearance, a breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Inside the backpack was a school identification card for Emma Reynolds. Williams immediately contacted the Fairview Police Department, who notified the FBI. Within hours, the remote area was transformed into a major crime scene. The backpack was confirmed to be Emma's, containing her identification card, a coloring book, and several small toys. There was no sign of Jessica's belongings or of the girls themselves. The discovery triggered a massive new search operation. Over the next week, hundreds of law enforcement officers and volunteers combed the state forest, covering every inch of ground within a 5-mile radius of where the backpack was found. Cadaver dogs were brought in. Divers searched a small lake half a mile from the site. Helicopters with thermal imaging scanned the densest sections of forest. Nothing more was found. Forensic analysis of the backpack revealed no fingerprints other than Emma's and Diana's, the latter explained by Diana having helped her daughter pack it the morning of the disappearance. There was no blood or other biological evidence. The condition of the backpack, relatively clean and undamaged, despite having been outdoors for months, suggested it had not been there long, raising the possibility that it had been planted to mislead investigators. This theory gained traction when a thorough review of the previous search efforts revealed that the area had been examined in late June, shortly after the twins disappeared. The search logs indicated that a team had passed within 50 yards of where the backpack was eventually found. While it was possible they had missed it, experienced search coordinators considered this unlikely. The working hypothesis shifted. If the backpack had been placed there recently, it meant that someone with knowledge of the twins' whereabouts was still active, perhaps monitoring the investigation. This realization sent a chill through both law enforcement and the Millfield community. It suggested that the case was not simply a tragic, static event from the past, but an ongoing situation with an unknown perpetrator still involved. In October 1991, the FBI expanded their investigation to include recent parolees, individuals with histories of child abduction across multiple states, and transient populations that might have passed through the area in June. They re-interviewed every witness, including Diana and Thomas Reynolds, now approaching the questioning with the assumption that the perpetrator might have returned to the scene or otherwise remained connected to the case. Diana's reaction to the backpack discovery was complex. In her fifth interview with investigators, conducted on October 3rd, she expressed both hope and terror. "It means they might still be alive," she said, according to the transcript. "But it also means someone has had them all this time." The interview notes describe her as alternating between composure and despair, a woman balanced on the knife edge of possibility. Thomas, in his separate interview, focused on practicalities. He pressed investigators on forensic details, search methodologies, and follow-up plans. His background in engineering emerged in his systematic approach to the problem, breaking it down into components that could be addressed individually. Beneath this analytical veneer, however, witnesses noted moments when his facade cracked, revealing glimpses of a father consumed by helplessness. As 1991 drew to a close, the Reynolds case remained unsolved. The holidays were particularly difficult for the family. They kept the twins' Christmas presents wrapped beneath the tree, unable to put away hope, but equally unable to embrace it fully. The community continued to support them, bringing meals, offering to run errands, maintaining the finding room when Diana and Thomas needed rest. The new year brought administrative changes. The case file, originally housed in the Millfield Police Department, was transferred to the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation's Cold Case Unit. Special Agent Winters remained involved, but in a consulting capacity. Detective Hoffman, who had worked the case from its first day, requested a transfer to patrol duties, later telling a colleague, "I see those little girls in my dreams. I need some distance." The media coverage, which had been constant during the first months, gradually waned. Anniversaries of the disappearance warranted mentions on local news, sometimes making regional papers, but the national spotlight had moved on to newer tragedies. In Millfield, however, the case remained an open wound. The community had lost not just two children, but its sense of safety, its belief in the protective power of small-town life. Diana and Thomas remained in their home on Oak Ridge Drive, unable to leave the last place their daughters had been seen. They established a small foundation in the twins' names, raising money for search and rescue operations and child safety programs. Through this work, they connected with other parents of missing children, forming a community bound by a grief few others could comprehend. As the months turned into years, the Reynolds case became one of those mysteries that defined a generation in Millfield. Everyone remembered where they were when they heard the news. Everyone had a theory. Everyone felt the aftershocks of that June morning when two little girls vanished into thin air. And somewhere, perhaps, Jessica and Emma Reynolds waited for justice, for discovery, for their story to finally be told. But it would take 30 years and a dog digging in the woods for the next chapter to begin. 30 years passed. The small town of Millfield changed in the ways that all American towns changed between 1991 and 2021. Storefronts on Main Street cycled through businesses, smartphones replaced payphones, and children who once played freely in the streets now lived under the watchful eyes of doorbell cameras and GPS trackers. But beneath these surface transformations, the disappearance of Jessica and Emma Reynolds remained an unhealed wound in the community's psyche, a cautionary tale whispered to each new generation. Thomas and Diana Reynolds still lived in the same ranch house on Oak Ridge Drive. They had stayed, even as neighbors moved away and new families arrived. unable to sever this final connection to their daughters. The finding room remained, though its walls had been updated countless times as age yellowed the papers and new technologies offered fresh avenues for investigation. The map pins had been replaced by digital tracking systems, the bulletin board photos scanned and enhanced with modern software, the handwritten notes converted to searchable databases. Thomas's hair had gone completely white by the time he turned 60. He had retired from the hardware store in 2015, devoting himself fully to the foundation he and Diana had established. The Jessica and Emma Reynolds Child Safety Initiative had grown from a local effort into a nationally recognized organization, providing resources for families of missing children and advocating for improved search protocols. Diana, now 63, had never returned to the library. Instead, she had channeled her grief into education, earning a degree in criminology and working as a consultant for families navigating the bewildering landscape of long-term missing persons cases. Her expertise was born of experience, the endless bureaucracy, the cycles of hope and despair, the challenge of keeping public interest alive when leads grew cold. Cooper, the golden retriever who had waited so patiently at the foot of Emma's bed, had passed away in 2003. The Reynolds had not gotten another dog, finding the prospect of that particular loss too difficult to face again. Their home grew quieter with each passing year. The spaces once filled with children's laughter, now occupied by the steady hum of computers and the occasional visits from volunteers or law enforcement officials, with updates that seldom led anywhere. The case itself had evolved over the decades. The original investigation files, once contained in a few cardboard boxes, now occupied terabytes of digital storage. DNA testing, unavailable in 1991, had been applied to items from the twins' bedroom, the recovered backpack, and samples from Thomas and Diana themselves, creating genetic profiles that could be matched against unidentified remains. These profiles had been entered into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, and compared against thousands of cases nationwide. No matches were ever found. The most promising development had come in 2003, when advances in digital image enhancement allowed technicians to extract more detail from the Millfield Savings Bank's security footage. The enhanced images confirmed that two small figures consistent with the twins' size were indeed in the back seat of Diana's car at 7:52 a.m. on the day of the disappearance. This vindicated Diana's account that the girls had left the house with her that morning, but did nothing to explain their subsequent vanishing. In 2010, the FBI had reopened the case as part of a nationwide initiative focusing on long-term missing children. Special Agent Raymond Teller, who had been a junior agent on Victoria Winter's team in 1991, led the new investigation. His team re-interviewed surviving witnesses, re-examined evidence using modern techniques, and created detailed timelines incorporating all known information. This effort generated several new leads, including a deathbed confession from a convicted child abductor in Pennsylvania, who claimed knowledge of the Reynolds case. The confession proved false, a desperate grab for attention from a dying man, but it had briefly rekindled public interest. The 20th anniversary in 2011 had brought a flurry of media coverage. National news magazines ran retrospectives, true crime podcasts devoted episodes to the case, and streaming services included it in documentaries about unsolved disappearances. The renewed attention generated tips, as it always did, but none led to a breakthrough. By 2021, the Reynolds case had settled into the peculiar half-life of famous cold cases never forgotten, periodically revisited, but fundamentally unchanged. Until April 18th, when Melissa Donovan took her Australian Shepherd Bailey for a walk in Fairview State Forest. Donovan, a 36-year-old veterinary technician, had moved to Fairview just 6 months earlier, unaware of the forest's connection to the Reynolds case. She chose a trail that Sunday morning based on a hiking app's recommendation, looking for a moderate 5-mile loop that would tire out her energetic dog. The path she selected was not the fire road where Emma Reynolds' backpack had been found 3 decades earlier, but a newer trail that intersected with it, cutting through what had once been nearly impenetrable underbrush. Approximately 2 miles into their hike, Bailey veered off the trail, nose to the ground, tracking a scent that only he could detect. Donovan called him back repeatedly, but the dog, normally obedient, continued pushing through the underbrush. Concerned, she followed, fighting through brambles until she reached a small clearing, where Bailey was frantically digging at the base of a massive oak tree. "I thought he'd found an animal burrow," Donovan later told investigators. "I was worried about him tangling with a raccoon or something worse, so I tried to pull him away." But Bailey persisted, and as Donovan moved closer, she saw what had captured the dog's attention, a small patch of faded pink fabric protruding from the soil. Her first thought was that someone had buried trash, perhaps an old shirt or blanket. She reached down to remove it, wanting to clean up the forest, and found herself gripping what appeared to be the strap of a child's backpack. The significance didn't register immediately. She tugged at the strap and the backpack emerged from the soil, along with something that made her drop it instantly and back away, a small, dirt-encrusted bone. Donovan used her phone to photograph the site, then marked the location on her hiking app before calling. The Fairview Police Department responded within 30 minutes, and upon seeing the pink backpack, immediately contacted the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Investigation, which had maintained jurisdiction over the Reynolds case. By nightfall, the clearing had been transformed into a methodical archaeological dig. Forensic anthropologists from the State Crime Lab established a grid system, and technicians began the painstaking process of sifting through soil, documenting and preserving every item they uncovered. The initial bone Donovan had seen was soon joined by others, all consistent with a child's skeleton, partially scattered by animal activity over the years. Alongside the remains, investigators recovered a second backpack, this one featuring Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles designs, unmistakably matching the description of Jessica Reynolds' school bag. Inside were the decomposed remnants of a child's lunch, a plastic sandwich container, an apple core, and a juice box, along with a small notebook bearing the name Jessica Reynolds in a child's handwriting. The discovery sent shockwaves through both the investigative team and the community. Within hours, news had reached Thomas and Diana Reynolds, who arrived at the scene just before dusk, standing at the perimeter of the police tape, hands clasped together, watching as technicians carefully excavated what they already knew in their hearts were the remains of their daughters. DNA testing would later confirm what the personal effects had already suggested. The remains belonged to Jessica and Emma Reynolds. They had been dead since 1991, buried in a shallow grave less than 20 miles from their home, less than half a mile from where Emma's backpack had been found 3 months after their disappearance. The cause of death was more difficult to determine after so many years. The forensic anthropologist's initial examination suggested blunt force trauma to both skulls, but a conclusive determination would require extensive laboratory analysis. What was immediately apparent, however, was that the twins had died wearing the clothes. Diana had described them leaving home on that June morning 30 years earlier. Jessica in purple shorts and a white t-shirt with a rainbow design, Emma in denim overalls and a yellow shirt. The investigation immediately pivoted, with the question of what had happened to the Reynolds twins finally answered. At least in part, the focus shifted to how they had ended up in Fairview State Forest, and most importantly, who had put them there. The first breakthrough came from a re-examination of the original case files. In 1991, investigators had catalogued a list of registered sex offenders within a 100-mile radius, all of whom had been interviewed and eventually eliminated as suspects. Among them was Gerald Hoffman, a 43-year-old former school janitor who had been convicted of molesting 2 young girls in Cincinnati in 1983. Hoffman had been released from prison in 1990 and moved to his mother's home in Lancaster, approximately 30 miles from Millfield. When interviewed in July 1991, Hoffman had provided an alibi for the day of the twins' disappearance. He claimed to have been at a job interview in Columbus, followed by lunch with his probation officer. The alibi had checked out, with both the potential employer and the probation officer confirming their meetings with Hoffman. He had been crossed off the suspect list and largely forgotten. In 2021, however, Special Agent Teller's team discovered a critical oversight in the original investigation. While Hoffman's meetings had indeed taken place, the timing left a significant gap. His job interview had ended at 11:30 a.m., but his meeting with the probation officer hadn't begun until 2:00 p.m. Those 2.5 hours were more than enough time for him to have driven to Millfield, encountered the twins, and driven away again. More damning still, a review of Hoffman's mother's phone records from 1991, preserved in the case file but never fully analyzed, showed a call from her home to the Millfield Methodist Church, where Little Explorers was housed on June 15, 1991. 2 days before the disappearance, the call had lasted 3 minutes. Hoffman himself had died in 2013 from liver cancer, but his mother, Evelyn Hoffman, was still alive at 94. Living in a nursing home in Lancaster. When interviewed by investigators in May 2021, her memory was fragmented by dementia, but certain details remained sharp. She recalled her son owning a dark blue work van in the early 1990s, which he had sold suddenly in late 1991. More significantly, she remembered him taking frequent drives to Fairview State Forest, supposedly for fishing trips, though she never saw him bring home any fish. Investigators searched property records and discovered that the Hoffman family had owned a small hunting cabin near Fairview State Forest from 1976 until 1995, when Evelyn sold it following a stroke that left her partially paralyzed. The cabin itself had been demolished by the new owners, but its location was less than a mile from where the twins' remains were found. This confluence of circumstantial evidence made Gerald Hoffman the prime suspect in the abduction and murder of Jessica and Emma Reynolds. But with Hoffman deceased, the investigation faced the challenge of building a case solid enough to provide closure without the possibility of a confession or trial. Forensic teams returned to the burial site, expanding their search area and employing ground-penetrating radar to look for additional evidence. They found it approximately 50 yards from the original grave, a metal box, the kind used to store fishing tackle, buried beneath 6 inches of soil. Inside were several items that chilled even the most experienced investigators: a disposable camera with undeveloped film, 2 hair ribbons matching those the twins had been wearing in their last school photos, and a carefully folded piece of notebook paper containing a list of names, including Jessica and Emma Reynolds. The film was carefully developed using techniques designed for degraded materials. The resulting images were grainy and discolored, but unmistakable photographs of the twins, clearly frightened, inside what appeared to be a rustic cabin. The final photo showed an adult male hand resting on a table beside what forensic analysts identified as a hunting knife. Handwriting analysis of the list found in the metal box confirmed it matched samples of Gerald Hoffman's writing from his prison and probation records. The list included 6 names, 4 of which matched known missing children cases from Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky between 1992 of the cases had been solved. 1 child had been found deceased in 1994. Another had been located alive in 1991 after escaping from an abductor whose description matched Hoffman. The remaining 2 children on the list besides the Reynolds twins had never been found. The girls investigators believed had willingly left with Hoffman, explaining why no one had witnessed a struggle. He had taken them to his family's cabin in Fairview State Forest, where the photographs were taken. Based on the forensic examination of their remains, they had been killed within 24 to 48 hours of their abduction, likely on the evening of June 17th or morning of June 18th. 3 months later, as the investigation intensified and search teams combed the area around Millfield, Hoffman had returned to the burial site, retrieved Emma's backpack and planted it along the fire road, where Katie Williams eventually found it, a calculated move designed to redirect the search away from the cabin. The discovery brought a measure of closure to Thomas and Diana Reynolds. After 3 decades of uncertainty, they finally knew what had happened to their daughter. They held a proper funeral on July 10, 2021, burying Jessica and Emma in the Millfield cemetery beneath a single headstone, bearing both their names, their school photographs, and the inscription, "Together in life, together in eternity." But just as the case seemed resolved, a new complication emerged. Among Gerald Hoffman's possessions, preserved by his mother and now examined by investigators, was a small address book. Most entries were mundane family members, former co-workers, medical appointments. But one name stood out: Michael Foster, listed alongside a Millfield phone number. Foster had been a maintenance worker at the Millfield Methodist Church in 1991, with access to Little Explorers during operating hours. He had been interviewed during the initial investigation but quickly eliminated as a suspect when multiple staff members confirmed his presence at the church throughout the day of the disappearance. Investigators located Foster, now in his 70s, living in a retirement community in Florida. When confronted with the address book entry, he initially denied knowing Hoffman. Under pressure, however, he admitted that they had met in prison in the mid-1980s, where both were serving sentences for crimes against children. They had maintained sporadic contact after their releases, though Foster claimed they hadn't spoken since. This connection raised disturbing questions. Had Foster provided Hoffman with inside information about Little Explorers? Had he participated in the abduction, or was the connection merely coincidental? 2 men with similar criminal histories who happened to know each other. Foster denied any involvement in the Reynolds case, and without physical evidence linking him to the crime scene, investigators could not definitively implicate him. He died of a heart attack in August 2021, before the investigation into his potential role could be completed. The uncertainty cast a shadow over what had seemed to be a resolved case. The official record listed Gerald Hoffman as the sole perpetrator in the abduction and murder of Jessica and Emma Reynolds, but footnotes acknowledged the Foster connection as an avenue of ongoing investigation. For Thomas and Diana Reynolds, these lingering questions were painful but ultimately secondary to the fact that they had finally laid their daughters to rest. In an interview given on what would have been the twins' 36th birthday, Diana expressed a sentiment shared by many who had lived in the shadow of this case for so long. Knowing is better than not knowing, even when what you know breaks your heart. The small town of Millfield, forever changed by the events of June 17, 1991, found itself changed again by their resolution. The community that had rallied around the search kept vigil during the long decades of uncertainty and supported the Reynolds through their ordeal, now faced the challenge of moving forward with knowledge rather than questions. In September 2021, the town council approved plans for a memorial garden on the grounds of the elementary school the twins had attended. The design featured 2 identical cherry trees, a bench for reflection, and a small bronze plaque bearing the simple message, "For Jessica and Emma, and for all children taken too soon, may we remember, and may we protect." Bailey, the Australian shepherd whose curiosity had finally brought the Reynolds case to its conclusion, was honored with a special commendation from the Ohio Governor's Office. Melissa Donovan, uncomfortable with the attention, declined most interview requests, but accepted the award on her dog's behalf, later donating the monetary portion to the Jessica and Emma Reynolds Child Safety Initiative. As 2021 drew to a close, new developments emerged. Analysis of degraded DNA found on the twins' clothing yielded a partial profile that, while insufficient for a definitive match to Hoffman, was consistent with his demographic markers. More significantly, soil samples from the metal box containing the photographs showed traces of a rare mineral compound used in fertilizer production in the 1980s, the same industry where Michael Foster had worked before his incarceration. This discovery suggested that Foster might have handled the box, potentially placing him at the scene of the crime or its aftermath. Without his DNA for comparison, however, investigators could not make a conclusive determination. The case file remained officially solved but annotated with these unresolved questions. In December 2021, during renovation work at the Millfield Methodist Church, construction workers discovered a small notebook hidden in the wall cavity of a maintenance closet. The notebook contained crude sketches of young girls, including two who resembled Jessica and Emma Reynolds, alongside writings that suggested detailed observation of the children at Little Explorers. Handwriting analysis indicated the notebook belonged neither to Hoffman nor Foster, but to a third unidentified individual. And so, 30 years after two little girls vanished from their small town, leaving behind questions that haunted a community for a generation, the answers that finally came brought not perfect resolution, but a different kind of uncertainty. The knowledge that evil is rarely simple, rarely contained, rarely understood completely, even when its victims are finally found. The Reynolds twins were laid to rest. Their parents granted the closure of knowing their fate, but the shadows surrounding their story continue to shift, suggesting depths of darkness still unexplored, and truths still waiting, perhaps, for another dog to dig in the right place at the right time.